What's going on, everybody? MikeO back with another episode of Hobby Talk. I appreciate you taking some time out of your day to listen to the show. Super excited to have another episode out, post lockout. None of that to worry about. Spring is here. Baseball season is very, very close. And I'm also very excited to have a special guest today, Nina S. Nina, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mike. Very, very excited to be here myself.
Well, I absolutely appreciate it. Nina S. is on YouTube, puts out videos from time to time, has a fantastic collection, great stories behind it. So we will certainly get into that. Nina, for people who aren't familiar with you, YouTube, I know you've done a little Instagram stuff as well. Just a really kind of brief history on where you are in social media and your story getting back into the hobby, being involved in cards, finding your way to a sports card podcast.
Well, it pretty much started again in 2018. I've collected on and off throughout my life. When I was a kid, my first set was, I mostly have 1970, 71 tops. Then it took a hiatus, and the 80s came along, and we all went crazy, and so did the card companies. But then in 2018, I was talking with my nephew Matt, and he was showing me a lot of the new modern cards, and I was like, wow, I couldn't believe how much cards had changed over the decades. So I got back in 2018, and that's the time when the Cleveland Indians / Guardians were pretty hot, and it was fun to start collecting again.
It's one of those things where a lot of people, that's what it takes, like someone introducing them or reintroducing them, and you just kind of look back and you start thinking about, of course, immediately your past with either the sport or collecting of some sort, and then you're kind of curious by the evolution, and then you kind of start looking into things, and it can snowball pretty quickly, and next thing you know, you're like, well, I'm more than back into the hobby, or more than into the hobby. You go through different phases, obsessions, even sometimes,
Yes.
feeling like you have to play catch up. And there's a lot of different ways and different paths that the hobby can take. And it is certainly, collecting is kind of a long term type of thing. Before we get too in depth into collecting things, just want to kind of address baseball as a whole. Upcoming season, 2022 season, fast approaching at the time of this recording, opening day, a little over a week away. I think we're like 10 days away, maybe 9 days. And to me, I'm in a positive frame of mind, have a positive outlook, super excited. The last couple years have obviously been abnormal, to say the least. 2020, we didn't know what was happening. We didn't know what was going on. We had a spring without baseball, and of course, so many other issues, far more important as well. But as a baseball fan, you just kind of kept waiting, like, oh, when is this going to start? And when you kind of realized, all right, they'll be able to play, of course, you had the bickering going on of how and what they're going to do between the players and the owners. And I knew beforehand, but you knew we had a looming lockout / strike coming up. 2021, you still had a season where we didn't start at full capacity, started with no fans in some areas, limited fans in others. As the year went on, eventually some of those restrictions went away and you had some full-blown stadiums. I know for me personally, I only made it to one game last year, and that's completely abnormal from the way things were for a long time. But just to me, this season, it feels like the first like normal opening day in a while. And with the lockout finally being settled, I mean, knowing we're getting 162 games, to me, I couldn't be more excited for the upcoming baseball season. Nina, do you have any thoughts on this upcoming season?
No, I'm with you. It was a really rough couple of years, past 2 years, for many reasons. And, in a big scheme of life, baseball is just a game, but it's America's pastime, and it kind of grounds us in, normalcy of life. And so, I was very grateful to have whatever baseball we had. But I am so happy that this is going to be a normal year. So happy they settled the lockouts because it was starting to freak me out a little bit. Like we were going to have another crazy year of baseball. And I just enjoy it. I mean, obviously, as a fan of the Cleveland Guardians, this is probably not going to be our stellar year. Me trying to be optimistic there, but there's a couple players that I'm excited to see again, and we have a lot of young guys. To me, you just never know who the next star is going to be. Jonathan India took off from Cincinnati last year, so who knows? Maybe one of our Guardian players will outshine our expectations. But like you, Mike, I'm ready to go to the games. I'm already trying to line up some dates so I can get back out there.
Yeah, and it's you never know when the building blocks start because I can look back at like old highlights and the Phillies always put out home companion videos back in the late 80s, early 90s, and now they continue to do it, video yearbooks, and you can go back and kind of watch teams evolve and grow. You can see the '08 Phillies who won the World Series. You can see them grow through the mid and early 2000s, and then really it's really interesting, and they were a little more behind the scenes heavy. The '93 Phillies team, which is kind of a legendary team, which I'm still shocked. I've said it before. I'm shocked that they haven't made some sort of ESPN 30 for 30 on the team or some sort of documentary, just because that was a wacky team full of characters. Honestly, they could probably make like a movie about that team. But if you look at those old home games, '89 is where it kind of started, where they start breaking up the team they had then. They made some trades. They
Right.
acquired guys like Lenny Dykstra and John Kruk. And then '90 and '91, but you see the team build up to what they became in '93. So there's something to look forward to every year, whether your team has World Series aspirations that year, playoff aspirations. I think most fans are somewhat realistic. You'll be optimistic and you're hoping for the best, but you kind of know going in every year what your likely limitations are, but you never know. Surprises
Right.
do happen. And we're at a time where you hear a lot of national people, or I hear different people kind of talk down on baseball from time to time. But there's no doubt that the young stars in this game right now are just unbelievably talented. I mean, it's an incredible crop of players. So to get out there and go to a game, to see even, you want to see your team succeed, but just to have a chance to witness other players, other teams,
Right.
potential Hall of Famers, to know that you got an opportunity to see some of these guys that people in 10, 20, 30 years will be looking back being like, man, I wish I got to see that guy pitch. And sometimes you do take that for granted. Like young Clayton Kershaw, used to see him pitch, and it's like now you look back and like, man, I was really lucky to have an opportunity to see that, see an all time great,
Yeah.
at his peak. So
Yeah.
it's just very exciting.
No, definitely. You were saying the other night, I think it was on your sale about, you want to go when the Angels come to Philly. And that's kind of how I feel. All right, so my team might not be the best, but I can go when we play the White Sox and the Angels and, yeah, even the Yankees, and see some awesome players that, from for the rest of my life. And I can, oh, yeah, I saw that guy play, and he was awesome. They beat us 12-2. But anyway, yes, very exciting.
And, every year is a new story. I mean, people love reality TV. I mean, I guess, I don't know if that's still the big craze in the TV world anymore, but like the true reality TV is the news, which is ever popular. I mean, granted, things have changed a little bit now where sometimes it's a little different than it used to be for sure. But sports, it's a reality show. Every night is a new episode, and then you
Right,
have the whole season, and it's built up on previous seasons. And for baseball, one of the great things is the tradition.
right,
Some franchises are only 20 years old, but a lot of franchises have 100 plus years of history and tradition and evolutions, and things change. Sometimes, things change in a small way with a little uniform tweak. Sometimes a big change with a full blown team nickname rebranding, which obviously you're having this year. So opening day, you get the very first opening day for the Cleveland Guardians. So I mean, there's got to
Right.
be something interesting and historical to some degree about that, which is definitely fun.
Oh, definitely. It's an exciting time, and I know a lot of people. It's a lot of people are very unhappy about it, and I understand that. The continuity of how long we've been the Cleveland Indians, but you know, eras. There are eras in baseball, and this is a new era. And it's a name. We're still Cleveland, and Cleveland has had a rich, rich baseball history. So I don't think anything really changes that way.
And of course, baseball has a rich history, and we will definitely be getting into some vintage card talk shortly. But the fantastic history of baseball, that's one of the things to me that makes collecting fun. And I love the ultra modern stuff and the modern stuff. I personally am someone, I truly enjoy it all. I love it all. I love the pre
Mm-hmm.
war, I love the vintage, modern from when I was growing up, the ultra modern just to see, hey, who's this guy going to become or how things are going to develop and all of that collecting. But the history of baseball is just so unbelievable, and there's so many ways to follow it. And I think that's something that will help a lot of people if you're collecting vintage and if you're getting involved in vintage. And a lot of the newer people in the hobby are going to start with modern and ultra modern, and that's just the natural way people start. They kind of start in the here and now and oftentimes work their way back a little bit.
Right.
And that's the way I did it. I got involved in 1989, got some packs for my birthday, opening them up, looking at them with my dad. He's telling me about some of the players, some of the guys I didn't know, getting excited to get like Bob Dernier and these guys who were on the Phillies at the time. And then you kind of grow with that and you're growing up and you're following them year after year. And then you get a chance where you can kind of take a step back and start building up and adding vintage stuff and learning a whole kind of new ball game.
Yes. It's been fun for me too. Like, I've got the heritage of the Reds because I became a Reds fan as a kid just to make my dad mad because he was such a Cleveland fan. So I thought that was funny. And we actually lived closer to Cincinnati. And it was the time of the Big Red Machine. It was really kind of hard not to be a Reds fan. But, throughout time, the different teams that we've had or that I've followed, I've moved around a lot in my corporate days. And, I got to spend a big chunk of time in the Dallas area. So I got to see a lot of the Rangers. And, that to me, that's just kind of part of my history then. So when I look at cards of players from that Rangers era, it brings back a lot of good memories. So I think it's just how baseball is so intertwined with our own personal history is always exciting to me.
The personal collection, the personal connection to your collection
Right.
is absolutely one of the strongest parts of appreciating and enjoying the hobby. Now, right now, there's a lot of kind of promoting the expensive trades and the expensive cards. And what I think a lot of people need to realize, and if you're new to it, it gives you a chance to kind of take a step back and be like, not feel overwhelmed, is
Right.
the gigantic cards, the super expensive cards, these $100,000 cards, they are not the norm and they are not the reality that most people live in. So you can appreciate and enjoy and collect how you want and what you can afford. And there's so many ways to collect. Oftentimes now everything's got to be slabbed, and I enjoy graded cards probably a little too much. um,
Right.
but the matter of fact is, most people are going to collect what they can collect, and they're going to collect different ways. And people have expansive collections. Like for me, I have stuff in binders, I have stuff in top loaders, I have stuff that's graded, and there's cards I love that are probably valued at about a dime or a quarter. And there's
Right.
cards I have that I love that are valued well beyond that, maybe hundreds of dollars. So there's so
Right.
many different ways, but the things that always like matter the most to me are those things that I are either nostalgic because it's a player that I grew up idolizing, or a card of a moment in time that I shared with a family member. There's just so many different ways and different aspects that can build you up. And that's something that you can. Some things have to be connected to your own experiences, but other things you can almost build up and almost create in a way. Like you had mentioned at one point, we were talking Ken Burns baseball, amazing
Mm-hmm.
documentary.
Mm-hmm.
Something that if you're a baseball fan and you haven't seen,
Yeah,
you
you
should
need to.
probably see. You should find a way to see it. It's one of those things that I've watched in part so many times. Obviously, I've watched straight through multiple times too.
Right.
Trying to think, I think I watched it's kind of in sequence about a year ago or so. But other
Mm-hmm.
times I'll literally just watch clips from it, or one episode at a time. But you watch these things, and you almost start to feel like you've seen these guys play, and even some of the movies, some of the Hollywood
Yeah.
versions, the movie 42, the movie
Yes.
61, you get kind of a little glimpse of these players, and then you see the surrounding players too, and that can it sounds like it shouldn't, but it can. Watching that movie can connect you and make you actually enjoy the hobby a little more. It's like, oh, I feel like I was watching Whitey Ford, like even though
Right.
it was an actor playing Whitey Ford or Roger Maris.
Right.
So many
It's
ways.
it's I think I've talked about before Doris Kearns Goodwin's Wait Till Next Year book about the Dodgers in the 50s and what it was like to be a Brooklyn Dodgers fan. And I know Alex Bowman 53 and we're always talking about how much we feel connected to the Brooklyn Dodgers via her storytelling. I mean, I felt as I was reading the book, I felt like I was that little girl who was so in love and devoted to this team and so heartbroken when they moved. She even talks about that. That's the thing too, when you're talking about like the old cards. I have a little farmhouse about an hour from my home, and it's an area where my mom grew up. And we always drive by this open field, which she always reminds me that's where her father just played baseball with a bunch of farmers. And it's kind of like Field of Dreams to me. I kind of have this imaginary game that I see my grandpa, who I never met, out there playing. And that's what kind of led me to some of the early 1900s cards, because unfortunately my grandpa smoked when he was pretty young. And I keep thinking like, oh, maybe he had this card, or maybe he had that card, or I wonder who his favorite player was. So it just, I don't know, baseball brings to life so many things in our own personal lives. Again, I keep saying that over and over again, but it does. And you really feel, like you said, part of the rich history of baseball, and which is really the history of the United States. So,
You say it because it's absolutely true. There's so many old cards. I do look at old players and I'm like, this was someone's favorite player, or
yeah,
someone went to a game and saw this guy get a big hit, and
yeah,
like it's all connected and quite often underappreciated, I'm sure, by the whole of collectors out there. People who just maybe aren't aware, and I think that's the thing starting out when you get involved in the hobby and you're collecting the modern players, the ultra modern cards, and whether that was 10 years ago or currently today, that's what you know and you grow comfortable with.
mm-hmm.
So I guess the question comes to people who haven't started yet that are maybe curious, maybe they want to, why collect vintage? What's a reason to collect vintage? Or how do you get started collecting vintage? Because even though once you're in, vintage is so much more simple than the ultra modern stuff,
Right,
it feels like if you're into the ultra modern stuff, you're almost not going to know where to start with vintage because you're going to feel overwhelmed. So,
right.
what are your thoughts on that topic as you've begun to get involved in the vintage collecting over the last several years.
Sure. Um, you know, I remember I listened to your um, podcast with Dustin Bellinger, I believe, and he was talking about vintage. And I can even remember where I was. I was cleaning up my garage one spring, and he just talked with such I don't know. He's had such passion for the cards. And I remember him saying something like, just pick a player or pick a team and check out that player. See what you can find out about that player or that card. And then fast forward a couple months, and I was emailing with Rick of Vintage Oddball Cards, and I was like, I really would like to get into vintage cards because I am such a fan of the history of the sport. But I get so overwhelmed, like you said, where there's so many options. And Rick said, well, you're a Cleveland Indians fan, and I think he goes, from what I've seen of you, that maybe you'd be interested in collecting Larry Doby. And I was like, yes, of course, Larry Doby, the 48 the first African American League player. And then Rick was also like, or you could think about collecting players who maybe grew up in Ohio. His point was find a way to connect with the vintage cards personally. And that's how I got started. But you're right, Mike. Once you get in there, even, it's kind of overwhelming. So you have to kind of go in, step back out, take a look, refocus, go back in, and my collection is always morphing, my vintage collection. But it's just exciting. You can't believe that you can get so much excitement out of these old cards, but you definitely can get excited about it. So I've always wanted to ask you, Mike, though, how did you get started with vintage? I know you have a lot of vintage in your collection. We don't probably see as many videos about it, but I know you have it. So
I think I just started slowly picking some up and
mm-hmm.
just kind of kept doing it. And I think, like a lot of people, when I started it, I was a little hesitant because you feel like you're an expert, whether you are or not, you feel like you're an expert on the modern stuff and you
Mm-hmm.
know it so well. And you know what you should or shouldn't pay for certain things, or you know what the cost is of it, or you know the players and the vintage stuff. I think just starting out and getting interested in it, you kind of see a lot of people have the blinders and they think, oh, vintage is so expensive. And in reality, of course, there are vintage cards that are very expensive,
Right.
but there's also ultra modern cards that are really expensive. And there's a lot of vintage that is very affordable. It's just different tiers. A lot of the pricing comes down to condition and learning the
Right.
condition and understanding. And I do think grading helps with that, and even helped me with that because it made it a lot easier to see what you should or shouldn't potentially be paying for certain cards. And
Yes.
you have to get used to different conditions. And I've gotten to the point now, and you start off in different ways, and you're going to evolve as a collector in general. Like, you just are. And even if money is like a centric per, if money's a big reason why you collect, like, and people have different reasons, even vintage is like, that's the more safe route to go. It's going to stay steady. It should theoretically grow at a slow pace over time. Of course, we've seen with a lot of stuff things spike from time to time in the last couple of years, but that's
Right.
not the normal way it rolls. But for me, I'm interested in the Hall of Famers, interested in players I felt some sort of connection to and knew. And then at a certain point, I was like, I did want to do the Phillies Ultimate Tops team set, and I was obviously working on that for a while. Definitely not an overnight project. And I wanted to expand into some other players I knew and recognized and such. And then from there, it's like I finally collected every Phillies Tops team set, 1951 through the newest release. And I was like,
Wow.
where else do I go? And I was like, well, Phillies have been around since the 1800s. Let's get into
Yeah.
pre war. And it is a lot of fun. And I think the vintage stuff, looking at like the 50s, 60s stuff, what's really nice is we still have stories, even though at this point some of them might be from a while ago. Like I have stories of hearing about some of these players growing up from
Right,
aunts and uncles and such
right,
that have, gone away, over the decades. And
right.
then I can have, like, my dad's will talk about some of the players he really liked or some of the players his brothers liked and stuff like that. And I think that makes vintage a lot of fun too. And it does make that personal. And you don't necessarily have that with some of the pre war stuff, but you can kind of build up and connect with stuff. So it
Yeah,
just
and I
takes
would
time.
say it does take time, and I would say, like you said, you're talking to your dad. Um, it I, when I started back in the vintage, when Rick and I were talking about this, we're talking about the 1948 Cleveland Indians who won. This is the last time we won the World Series. So, and that was about the time my parents started dating. Now, my dad had been in the Navy, came back, went to college, and that's where my parents met. And so my mom was telling me not too long ago um, that when they first met, that's all my dad could talk about was the Cleveland Indians. And I just think it's funny. I never, my dad and I never sat down and really had a conversation about the 48 Cleveland Indians, which I'm very sorry about now that he's gone. But um, now, when I look at those cards, again, just like with my grandfather, like I wonder who my dad's favorite player was. Or we had a family friend, Mrs. Dubin. My mom said, "Oh, she loved Larry Doby. That was her favorite player." And just just hearing those stories, and then picking up the cards and thinking about, would my dad have liked this card? Did my dad have any cards? Did he take one on his Navy ship? Just I don't know. It brings those family connections out. So I would say too, if you all of you who have grandparents, because I'm considerably older than most of you, but if you have grandparents who are still around, ask them, bring those up. Especially, I think. Well, I wouldn't just say your grandfathers. Like my mother is a huge Cleveland Guardians fan, so ask them about who were the players they admired the most, and just pick up those cards. And you were talking, Mike, too, about, and we'll probably get into this more, about graded versus raw cards with vintage. And mostly I buy graded because I want them to be authentic. Um, but recently I picked up a 1950 Larry Doby that is totally beat up. It's worn out. It has creases all over the place. But I picked it up because I was like, some kid carried this around in his or her pocket and just, valued this card. And the card looks good. It's centered nicely. And I don't really care, if somebody trimmed it, oh, well, that doesn't really matter to me because I already have a graded uh, Larry Doby 50 Bowman. But it's that excitement of just feeling a card that maybe somebody had, 50, even 100 years ago. Sorry, I get kind of crazy and zealot about these things. So,
Well, it's just one of the many options and ways to do things. If you're buying graded, if you're buying a more expensive card, a pricier card,
right.
there's a lot of benefits to buying it graded. Sure, you might pay a little more, you might pay a little more of a premium, but you have the peace of mind knowing a professional's opinion on the condition and
Yes.
its authenticity, and kind of a way to figure out a fair price point. For sure. So I'd certainly recommend that with certain stuff, but that doesn't mean you should
Yes.
turn down opportunities to buy raw stuff. Just proceed with a little more caution. I mean, I buy beat up stuff a lot, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't care, but if I get it at the right price, it's fine.
Right.
I personally have had very few issues ever getting burnt on buying raw stuff, but I know that it exists, and I know a lot of people. Some of it can be very obvious, and people just don't look at it. I've actually been to a
Right.
few just random auctions, and I remember looking and being like, at a card, I'm like, that just does not look right. And I've actually seen a few cards that literally were labeled reprint and then had some guys bidding on them. Like, yeah, just so you know, that's a reprint. And the guy's like, ah,
Right.
you don't know what you're talking about. I'm like, all right, man, I told you,
Yeah,
go
you
for it.
have to be
But, you
very
know,
careful.
um, I mean, those are different ways to do it. And if you're buying more common, like if you're like, all right, you know what, I want to start off, I like 53 tops or 52 tops, the first more standard size set, whichever you want. 52 is a little more pricey. Or if maybe 50 or 51 Bowman, whatever. If you're buying some of those commons, you can get the raw ones that aren't in great condition at really reasonable prices.
Right.
And maybe some of them are theoretically altered because they were beat up in some certain way, but people,
Right.
generally speaking, are not trimming those cards. And so,
Right.
and condition wise, like if you were to get it graded and it'd be a 2-3, the price difference is it's so minuscule that it really honestly doesn't matter. So I think it, raw grade it. I think it just depends on what the item is and what your preference is. Some people like to have everything graded. To me, I
Right.
used to love getting things graded in any condition, but also 3-4 years ago, you could grade cards for $6, $7, $8, and it wasn't a
Yeah.
big deal. But now, with grading prices closer to $30 and $50, you do have to take a step back and decide, is that worth it or not? And there have been times I've gotten Phillies cards that I want graded because I like having, especially with the odd releases, I like having the identification there, and I just like having portion of that collection slabbed where I'll just bite the bullet and pay the grading fee. I'm like, oh, this is like an $8 card, but whatever.
Right.
That's just a personal choice for me, the way I want that portion of my collection. But
Right.
some people
I
like to
think too.
display them all in binders too.
Right. Yeah. And, I sit down with some of my binders and flip through them. But I think with grading too, with vintage, if you're really a modern, ultra modern collector, then you're looking for 9.5s, 10s. But then when you shift to vintage, it's a whole new world. Yeah, you can. Well, I don't know that I've seen any 9s or 10s in vintage cards, but there are 7s and 8s.
Oh, I've seen few. Doesn't mean
Yeah,
it was one I was ever in a position to purchase.
right, exactly. But I mean, there's so many. I'm looking right now. I have a 56 Jackie Robinson that's a 3. But if you looked at that card, if you could see that card, there's nothing wrong with it. It's beautifully centered. I'm sure it has a few little bent corners and things like that. But you, again, you just decide what it is that you like in the looks of a card and you go after that. Some people don't want bend corners. To me, it's just like, oh, well, over time, corners are going to bend. But if it's centered nicely, that's what's appealing to my eye. And you can get cards for relatively reasonable prices. So I would say if you're trying to get into vintage and you're a little bit nervous about prices, no, there's cards out there that you can afford of players that you know. So
And, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Like, to me,
yes,
I agree. Centering and color, the registration and such. The
right.
corners, for a card from the 50s, the corners are supposed to have some wear. It almost doesn't look right. If I see a vintage card with 4 sharp corners, honestly, I feel like I'm looking at a Topps Archives card or something. So,
Right,
I
right.
mean, I think the highest, I have some cards, I think, from the 50s and 60s that I might have gotten graded that were like, maybe I got a few 8s, but that's pretty few and far between. Most of that stuff,
Yes,
you're looking at beautiful cards that are going to get you a 5 and a 6. And
right.
I'm at the point, and I've told a few people who kind of, I think thought I was joking, but I'm like, I honestly probably have never cared less about grading, even though I continue to grade, because I care about the grading, but I don't. The number doesn't matter. I have so many cards in my collection, and obviously the ultra modern, I'll remember. I'm like, oh, these are 10s, these are 9s. The
Right,
vintage stuff, like I forget. Like my
right.
53 Jackie Robinson, like I honestly don't remember specifically if it's a 1.5, a 2, 2.5. Like I gotta pull it out and look at it because
Right,
the card looks great. I like it.
right.
I'm happy to have it in my collection. I'm not going to be overly concerned with that grade. And I think it's easy to get lost in those numbers, and especially if you're kind of just starting out. Collecting
Right.
is it's a long-term thing. It takes a long time. It's kind of, I want to say, in a way, and I know there's some people who are less serious and more serious, but it's almost a lifestyle to a degree. I mean, obviously, you have a lot of important things in life to take care of, but it's something you
Right.
kind of do and you revisit often. I mean, for me, I'm obviously very deep into it, so it's very rare I go a day without looking at a card. Maybe on occasion I'll be up the mountains, but even when I'm up there, like, I'll usually have some cards with me, so I'll be thinking
Right.
about them. And I know maybe that's not your typical collector, specifically someone starting out.
Right.
But I mean, you have to think about it and take things slow. And it's hard because when you're just getting involved in the hobby, you're so excited you want to go crazy with it. And even if you start
Right.
getting into vintage, you're gonna want to go bonkers. You're gonna want everything, but you
Yeah.
have to keep in mind that, I mean, I guess vintage starts in 1980 is what people say. I honestly, when I think of vintage, I think more. I barely even think about like the 70s. I think like
Right.
50s, 60s, but that's
Right.
where my mind goes to. But you have to realize it's decades upon decades worth of stuff. And for me, with even like pre-war stuff, I'm like, you got 40s, 30s, 20s, 10s, 1890s, a handful of
Right.
cards in the 1880s. I'm like, that's a long time. And so there's a lot of different releases, and it's going to take you a long time to learn about different sets. And there's so many. You have your typical top sets year after year and a few years of Bowman, but then you have regional releases and food and beverage releases, and you're just always going to have something else you're discovering, and you're going to see your passion change from time to time too. Uh, Sometimes you're going to be more focused on one thing or another. Like, I'm kind of just all over the place personally. I don't know how you are specifically. I know some people are just hell bent on building sets. Like, I'm not.
Right.
I would love to build sets, and if money was no object, I would probably build every set of every release ever invented. But like, I'm not someone who has to feel like I'm a completionist. Like, I don't.
Right.
I wanted to complete my Phillies tops team set, but like, at this point, I'm happy having an example of a Phillies card from all the different releases that have ever been out there. And there's a long way to go because some are just so unbelievably rare. But when it comes to Hall of Famers, like, I don't feel the need to do a full player run
Right.
or build like a 1953 top set. Like, I would love to, but I also understand that would be a very pricey venture.
Right.
I just love grabbing different examples here and there.
No, I'm kind of the same way. I so admire Alex's um, Bowman 53 collection, and that makes you, seeing how he presents that collection makes you say, oh, yeah, boy, what I love to collect the whole set. But in reality, collecting many sets is almost impossible. And there's a lot of people out there after the T206 cards, and that's achievable. I mean, it's going to take you a while, but um, what I like to do is kind of come up with themes. And a current theme I'm working on right now is first baseman, and that's because I did play first base. I played catcher, first base, and some pitching when I was a kid in softball. And first base, though, was definitely the base that I loved playing, the position I loved playing the most. And so, on one, Alex has occasionally, he has like a live card room session. And so one night I was saying, I asked all the guys in there, I was like, oh, what's your favorite first baseman in action card? And my gosh, I got like 15 suggestions in about 2 minutes. And so that that so far has taken me from the 70s all the way down to the early 1900s. And so instead of going after all the T206 cards, I just kind of went through and said, okay, who were all the famous first basemen in the T206 set? So it gives me a sampling of T206 without actually having to go after the whole set, which I wish I could do, but um, And then even in that set, like that subset of first baseman, right now I'm kind of collecting them where they have a blue sky and a green field behind them, and they're actually throwing or catching. So, you can just make up these themes or stories, and that will get you started. And it's amazing how many first baseman cards, action first baseman cards that are out there. In fact, I think you just sent two to SGC for me, so I'm anxious to see those when they get back.
And there's just so I don't know. There's so many stories behind the cards too, which we talked about a little bit before. We talked about vintage and family
Mm-hmm.
members or
Mm-hmm.
connections that way to teams that are relatively recent history, even though some of these teams and seasons might have been 50, 60, 70 years ago. But like the early 1900s,
Mm-hmm.
like for me, I made the easy choice of collecting some Phillies. And I'm not
Mm-hmm.
opposed to picking up any just random cards either, because there's just so many that sometimes I'm like, that card just looks awesome. Like, I don't even know who that guy
Right.
is, but I'll learn something about it. And
Right.
like some of the old Phillies, I would be just researching on the internet as much as I can about them. I'm like, oh, this guy played, and I look up like on Baseball Reference, which is it's just an amazing website for baseball fans, and
Yes.
I'm looking up the career statistics and where the guy moved, and then I'm clicking around and reading stuff. I'm like, oh, this guy played 4 years and then moved to Florida to be a orange farmer or something. I remember the one guy, or maybe it
Right.
was no, one of them. One of the old Phillies guys had moved to Georgia and bought a peach farm or something. And I'm like, it's just
Right.
neat. It's interesting uh, to kind of see how some of these careers evolved and some of these players, and just to learn something new about a player or team. And I mean, baseball's got a very, very rich history, as you mentioned. It's really American history so much, and it's fun to collect vintage as well because you see the sport evolve. You see the hobby evolved in different sizes and types of cards. And I think if you really get yourself and allow yourself to get involved in vintage and learn even more about the history of the sport, that will give you a better appreciation of the sport in general, including the modern times,
Yes.
and a better appreciation for the hobby and actual rarity and stuff like that. Maybe even a different perspective. And, I like collecting the brand new stuff a ton. Uh, Not just Philadelphia players, but just guys I enjoy watching and rookies and guys who've been around for 2 decades and are on their way to the Hall of Fame. It's a lot of fun, but collecting the vintage, I think, has improved my appreciation. And I think sometimes we see this in the hobby, maybe not as much lately, but you have kind of like the two different worlds. You have the ultra modern and you have the vintage. You have people who are just focused on one thing or another. It's like
Right.
there's the perspective of, oh, this guy's a vintage collector. He's grouchy. He hates baseball, and it's not as good as it used to be, and it never will be. And then you have the ultra modern people who are like, those guys, they're all dead. They don't matter. Like, and it's like if you merge them, it's actually pretty great. Because,
Yeah.
and I've said it for a few years. I'm like I look at Otani, and I do remember when he came up, a lot of people like, this guy, and I'm like, I mean, we'll see if he succeeds, and obviously
Right.
last year he sure did. I'm like, how do you not appreciate watching this guy play? Like, he literally just hit a
Right.
487-foot home run and struck out the side in back-to-back
Right.
innings. Like,
Right.
and there's a lot of young talent, and it doesn't mean all these guys are going to the Hall of Fame, but to me, baseball is just, it's unbelievable right now. Juan Soto and Ronald Acuna Jr. and
Right.
Tatis when he stays healthy on the field, and that is a factor. Like, Fernando Tatis may
Right.
at some point be in Cooperstown. He might be. He
Right.
might not be. He might be someone maybe more like a Bo Jackson who had, 3 or 4 years where he was really good, really dominant. Granted, Bo Jackson had his time in the NFL as well, so maybe that's not a great example, but not every guy is going to be in the Hall of Fame. But
Right.
you can collect the vintage guys who are in the Hall of Fame, but you also look at it and you learn more. Like, I think when you get more into it and you buy and collect more of the vintage, and then you look at the Hall of Fame, and there are different levels to the Hall of Fame. You're a Hall of Famer, you're a Hall of Famer for sure,
Right.
but not all Hall of Famers are necessarily created equal. You can kind of take a look and see the difference between Hank Aaron and Bill Mazeroski, like two
Right.
entirely different players. One
Right.
little bit better than the other one. They're both immortalized in the Hall of Fame, and you look at
Right.
that with the modern day guys too. Like, there's a big difference between Craig Biggio and Ken Griffey Jr.
Right.
You know, they're both Hall of Famers, and they're both
Right.
there with plaques in Cooperstown.
Right.
Just two entirely different players. So I think that's something, crossing. I think you can also learn a lot about the modern game by looking at some of the vintage stuff and even collecting to a degree too, and see who ultimately does matter. Again, if you're in the investment side long term, like, you can learn some stuff from some of the vintage players, some of the greats of the past.
Yes, I mean, I had so many ideas popping in my head when you were talking there, but I think one key is to go back in time and try to find the Shohei Otani of a certain era. Why was this guy popular? So, when you collect vintage, well, when you collect modern, you get like mail every day, right? You're always you're ordering more cards, you're buying a lot of singles, and when you switch to vintage, that kind of slows down a lot depending on what direction you go. But you I remember Terry and Alex both have said, and you just said, like, when you get the card, you sit down and you read about the player and why was this player so good? Why is he in the Hall of Fame? And that will teach you a lot about, why people are the stars they are today too. So it's that constant connection back and forth. So I really, yeah, I think you're right. There are people out there who are definitely vintage and definitely ultra modern. But I think I would encourage anyone in either camp to explore the other camp, because there is a lot. There's so many great players today. I'm glad you brought up Tatis. I was like, oh, geez, I can't believe he broke his wrist. And is this going to change who he is? Which makes me sad because, I mean, I hope he overcomes it all. But he's such a great face of baseball. The NBA has all their superstars, and don't get me wrong, I love the NBA. I watch games all the time, but baseball could use those kind of superstars. So, but then you say, okay, well, who were the superstars way back when? I know a lot of people right now I've seen a lot on Instagram about a T206 card of a guy named Hal Chase. And I didn't know who Hal Chase was. Shame on me. But it was one of the bad boys of that era. It was gambling and betting on games and things. So, like, gosh, who would do that now? Well, I don't know. Maybe they are doing it. I mean, it's so easy to bet on games anymore. But um, I don't know. Just those rich, rich stories and connecting. Try to connect the past to the future and vice versa. Plus, we're also, I mean, the cards we're collecting now, someday they're going to be vintage cards, and we're going to be the people sitting around talking about, Mike Trout, Shohei Otani, many, many famous players. Shane Bieber, I hope, in my case.
Yeah, well, when the cards you first open are back in 1989, and you're thinking, they're not that old, and then you compute the years, I'm like, oh, I guess my 6-year-old nephew would consider them pretty old.
Oh shoot! Yes,
But
yes.
time flies, and things evolve and change, and that's one of the great things about the hobby, though. Like, I love a refractor and the shine as much as
Right,
anyone, but I also
right,
love that paper artistic look of the 50 Bowman, 51 Bowman.
right.
They're so cool. They're different, but they're all part of an evolution of a great game and a fantastic hobby that people have been involved in some way, shape, or form for a very, very long time.
I would say too, if you're trying to get into vintage, there's a giant, very heavy book called Classic Baseball Cards: The Golden Years, 1886 to 1956. It's by Frank Slocum, and as far as I know, it's mostly used copies that you can get out there. But what it has is it's a huge book with every set from 1886 to 1956 and colored pictures of all those sets. So you can just sit down and, sometimes over breakfast, like just flip through the book, look for, pictures that are interesting to me. Why, who is this player? Why was this photograph taken? Why was, who's done all the paintings of all these vintage cards? So if you really wanted an introduction, and the book doesn't cost that much, I think it's like $25-$30. So that's one direction. The other thing I think that got me interested is the classic Lawrence Ritter book called The Glory of Their Times, and where he sat down and just interviewed players, and they just spoken to his microphone, and he just recorded what they said verbatim. And Reese ND Card Ranger told me about the audio version of that card where you actually hear those players. So again, just figuring out ways to understand vintage. Sometimes that's just part of the excitement, even before you buy the cards. So
Yeah, and I definitely have that book. That book is
yeah,
awesome. And every now and then I'll just flip through and I'm like, oh man, I definitely need a card from that set. And I'm like, oh, I have that card. I've got one from that set. Oh, they made 10 of this guy. I wouldn't mind picking up another one of them. But some of them are pretty pricey and some not
yeah,
so much. But yeah, there's a lot of ways to get involved. And one way for sure, looking at the book and reading about, and it's just educating yourself and education, not just to learn so you know what you're doing, but maybe for a little inspiration as well. And obviously,
yeah.
there's a ton of people on YouTube that have just decades upon decades of
Oh
knowledge.
yes,
Um, and I'm sure there are vintage guys on Instagram, and there's going to be websites you can read stuff, and just even conversing with other collectors, you can be inspired to pick up different players or different cards or learn about different sets. I mean, just forever. I mean, I feel like I've seen so much, but I'm always seeing something else I didn't know about or being inspired to pick something else up because of someone else, a different collector um, that might be somewhat like minded, might be completely different, but
right,
you see something that inspires you and go, you know what? I really want to add either that card or a card from that set or something similar to my
right,
collection. And then you start looking at it. And it doesn't mean you go on eBay and be like, oh, click buy it now immediately. Maybe you hit the watch
right,
later and you just kind of keep an eye for auctions and things like that. Because there are, and you will learn as you go, and it depends from set to set, but there are certain, it's more so pre war, but there are certain cards that legitimately you will see. You maybe pass on and go, I'll get it later, and then you
right.
won't see that again for
Yeah,
2 or 3 years.
right,
But then there's other cards that you might jump on immediately and be like, oh, I need to get that card. It's from 1962 tops. And like in reality is you're going to be able to find one either at a show or they'll be listed on eBay fairly often or auction houses. It kind of depends on what grade or something you're looking
right,
for. But there's
right.
definitely different sets or different cards that are a little more rare than others. And it's just something that takes takes time to learn. It's easy to jump in and get overexcited. Um,
Yes,
but the key is you certainly want to balance yourself for many reasons. I don't think anyone ever wants to specifically overpay for something. There's a time here and there to do so,
hmm,
but at the same time, you have to realize like when you're looking at some of these cards that are going to be pretty pricey, you want to save some funds for some other things as well.
that's it's funny because I would love to own this Christy Mathewson card, and I've never paid that much money for a card. And I've been thinking lately, like, okay, I have some money saved up. Should I just take the money out and buy the card? And to me, I'm like, no, I think that you really should, like Scott Ranger Studios, you should like save up for the card. Like, put a little section in your savings account and just deposit X, amount of money every month, and then make that kind of you know, a gift you give yourself once a year or something like that, because it's a great investment. Really, I don't know. Who knows the future of anything? But I can't imagine that some of these cards that are extremely valuable are going to ever really depreciate. They might hold at what you paid for them, but And so what? I mean, really, my collection is for me. Like you said, it's for me to look at and to value and learn about. Someday when I'm gone from this good earth, then somebody else will reap the benefits, but they're not going to really know what I paid for it. So they'll just get what they get. And for me, it's just important to have somebody that you admire in your collection. So I wanted to say something too, Mike, about how important it is to when you watch the videos to comment and connect with some of these guys who are really vintage experts. I mean, they are. I mean, this community. I'm overwhelmed by the generosity of this community, but um, folks really want to share their passion with you. I asked, like, Maxa Jackson is a T206, I would say, expert, and I just messaged him on Instagram one day. I said, I would love to just sit down and have a phone conversation with you. He's like, okay. It's like we talked for an hour and a half one night. Same with Terry Mack of TJ Mack Vintage Cards. I mean, Terry writes such thoughtful comments, and he also will, I've emailed back and forth with him just about collecting in general. Sometimes, like you said, you get overwhelmed with your collection. You're like, oh, I feel like I'm going in a million different directions. And you have to kind of sit down and refocus. And somebody like Terry, who's been doing this for over 20 years, he's lived through this. So he's helped me kind of refocus different parts of my collection. And sometimes you jettison certain parts or just put them off to the side for a little while to really zoom in on what you want to focus on. So I would say if you are a person that's wanting to do some work with vintage, definitely go out there, just look on YouTube, find some guys. Mike and I've mentioned a couple people already, find those guys and just start. Just like with everything, sometimes you just need to start.
You just got to jump on in sometimes. Um,
Right.
no, I was going to say, even with like the value aspect, and that's not necessarily why you collect, but when you are spending money on some of the higher price vintage stuff, you do have the built in safety net of most likely there's not going to be a lot of volatility. You go
Right.
invest in a first Bowman prospect card,
Right.
autograph. Listen, that card might be $15,000 in 5 years. It could
Right.
also be $3. Like,
Right.
and even with the modern players, and a lot of them, and some are more established than others, but you are taking a chance.
Right.
You just don't know. I mean, these guys are human beings. You don't know where their life's going to lead. You don't know whether they'll stay healthy on the field. And there's the
Right.
comfort with some of the vintage stuff, whether it's an all-time legend, an all-time great, where it's just going to hold steady and slowly rise in value. Or you might even have, I have some cards of some Phillies guys that 99.9% of people have never heard of, but it's
Mm-hmm.
such a rarity that, if you pay, say, $200 for it, you'll be able to get that money back and maybe even more. It might take a while. It might not be something that, you get 174 offers in the first, 24 hours,
Right.
but you have no competition with it. There's like six in
Right.
existence. So, I mean, of course, and I've had people say, oh, it's this and that. And I'm like, listen, if there's a cataclysmic event, then the value of that card is going to be the least of your worries.
Right.
So, I mean, but
Right.
ultimately, like, the price is going to hold steady in all
Right.
likelihood. And even if there is something where things go up and down for a little while, like, it's going to find its way back to
Right.
where it is. And, it's a piece of Americana. It's a piece of baseball history. It's part of sports cards. And, it's just something that so many people love, and probably more people than we even realize. I mean, now that baseball card collecting or sports card collecting has become a little more mainstream, you're starting to see a few more people come out of the woodwork, and some people who don't share their collection or even tell people they collect, you're hearing about it
Right.
referenced a little more here and there. And then more and more people are, of course, because of that, getting involved. I've had a number of people I used to work with or people I grew up with who are suddenly back into cards, and I'm like almost like surprised. I'm like, oh man, like this guy's into it, and this person's back into it, and I mean that's pretty cool too. And so the
Yeah,
hobby is continuing to grow, and with the whole Fanatics deal and everything going on there, I mean, whether you're a fan of Fanatics or not, like
right,
they're pretty darn good at marketing products and buying in on stuff at the right time. So I think they see that the hobby is continuing to grow exponentially, and with the way they market, and I think card collecting is probably in a pretty good space. I mean, maybe you want to be selective what you buy, but if more people get involved, more people will eventually find their way to the vintage stuff. And I mean, I think that's a good thing if you have a decent collection. It's not
right,
necessarily a bad thing. And
right.
you think about it, there's a very small fraction of sports fans and people who attend games who collect cards seriously. So if it just grows by a very small percentage,
Right.
it will have effects. So that's kind of the way I look at it.
And it's important to tell the young people in your life about your collection, to share your collection, and even if it's just say, watch Uncle Mike's video. I mean, it's funny. I'll tell little kids sometimes I have a YouTube channel, and they're like, "What?" They're like, well, "That old lady, she's got a YouTube channel, woohoo!" But I've also got a couple of kids interested in collecting cards. And that's the most exciting thing to me is when you get somebody young interested in this hobby. And I've even had parents come up and thank me for introducing their child to collecting cards because it's just such a fun hobby and you can do it at so many levels. And for them, like you said, the cards I grew up with are vintage for them. So I'm now sharing those histories and that they can understand and appreciate. So I think it's just, really great, the community and how we can just share with each other both up and down the age ladder, and same with the cards, from the ultramodern to Allen and Ginter. So I don't know, it's pretty exciting. That's why I love talking about it. I love talking with you about it because I know you and I share a lot of the same enthusiasm. So
It's absolutely fun, and there's so much to unfold and to enjoy, and looking at them and enjoying them, and just even looking them up on eBay sometimes. I'm like, oh man, I want that card and I want that card. It's like you're like a kid in a candy store. I'm like, all right, I got to take a step back. And that's one of the great things about going to shows. Like, you don't even have to,
yeah,
of course, you go to a show and you want to buy things. And this
right,
past national, I did pick up a few bigger cards, but like typically at the national, I don't even buy that much. I just kind of take it in and look at stuff and kind of get
right,
inspired by stuff and just looking through the showcases. And sure, that 52 mantle and a 4 is amazing. But I know I'm not buying that card. I'm not going there carrying 50, $100,000 with me. But right next to it, you might have a card that's pretty darn nice as well, and it might be like $80. And you can
right,
think about it and be like, all right, that's at least on my radar. And there's so
right,
many great players and great looking cards. You just kind of take mental notes, or even, type them out on your phone, make a note, and
right,
look at the cards to potentially
right,
pick up, kind of make an ever going list. I mean, I have a
right,
list of cards that I'm looking to add at some point, kind of like a checklist or some stuff I need,
right.
just in a
Hey, I
Google
know.
document.
Yes, Google Doc, or just sometimes, like I sometimes just take a photo of the card and put it in a separate folder in my photos, and I'm like, oh, well, what were the cards I was looking at? So yes, because you definitely can't afford. Well, I can't. I don't know. Some people probably could, but I just can't afford to go out there and say, oh, I'm going to get these 10 cards this week. So, but I want to know if like if I'm just wanting to spend some time on eBay and look around at the cards, it's nice to know the list. And I do put a lot of my watch list too. Thank goodness for reminders of, what you have on your watch list. Cause I'm like, oh, and I think a lot with vintage cards, if you put them on your watch list too, that you will get a deal. If it's a buy it now, a lot of those folks, if you're on their watch list, that they'll send you a discount. So I would say put it on your watch list for at least a week before you pull the trigger, unless you're dying to have the card.
Oh yeah, I love the watch list. Just waiting for the offer request. Yeah, I think the limit. I forget if it's 200 or 500, whatever
Right.
eBay's limit is. But I just this morning I had to go through and be like, all right, click the end tab and delete a whole bunch of stuff because I was adding
Right.
stuff to it. I'm forever doing
Yes.
that. But Nina, it's
Yes.
been a fantastic conversation. We've somehow managed to go over an hour already. It's just always a blast talking about baseball cards, talking about
Yes.
baseball, talking about vintage cards. It is it's fun for sure, and I appreciate you taking some time out of your day to join Hobby Talk with MikeO. Any final thoughts you wanted to share with the audience?
I want to thank you, Mike, for inviting me to be on this. I mean, talking to the Mike O is pretty cool for me. So I'll mark this day down in my journal as a very special day. But um, no, I would just say, there's nothing I can't say that other people have already said. But if you're interested in vintage, I'd say just go buy one card. Take a look, think about your teams, think about something maybe your grandpa told you, and just go buy that card. You can buy it raw or graded. Just have some fun with it. That's what this hobby's all about, right, Mike? Having fun. So
If you're not having fun in this hobby, you're definitely doing something wrong and need to figure it out for sure. It's certainly a blast, and like I said, there's so many layers to it, so many different ways to do it. Just go out there, get yourself a few cards, test the waters. I'm sure you'll have fun. You'll get addicted, and you may or may not thank us later. If you don't, it'll be mostly because of your wallet, I'm sure. But
yes.
it's definitely fun.
Well, and let us know, right, Mike? We'd love to hear. If you did take a plunge on a certain card, what did you get, and why did you get it? So
For sure. So make sure you check out Nina S on YouTube. And if you're watching this podcast, if you're listening to it on YouTube, leave a comment down below. Also, Spotify, SoundCloud, I don't know, some other things that podcasts are on, they're all connected. Like them, comment on them if it allows you, and definitely appreciate the support. Hope to be back soon. Hope to have Nina on again soon, and appreciate everyone listening. Have a great one.